I'd like to take a little bit of a detour now and talk about the technology adoption curve. And the reason to do that is for you to understand the setting that's around you, and the context will be so important in thinking through over what period of time will people be adopting your innovation. And therefore, what do you need to do to think about how long will it take, what partners will you need, as well as what other technologies you may be depending on. This relates back to the whole idea of the so-called valley of death between researchers and research resources and commercialization. The challenge is there are fewer resources in the middle between the two, at the point of handoff. And so if you miscalculate the length of time to adopt your technology, you may in fact run out of money. So here's a slide that shows the pathway of adoption of lots of different consumer technologies. Color TV, as you can see, from 1970 to the late 2000s, got adopted pretty quickly and is now pretty universal. You also see how basic cable grew, but then it kind of leveled out, and now it's on the little bit on the decline. Personal computers shot up over that period of time, but take a look at VCRs. VCRs, if I talk to students, a lot of times they're not even sure why people would ever have wanted those, because they are so used to streaming services instead. And also, you just don't need a piece of equipment to be able to see a video these days or to record a video. So as you see, that's a product that's being abandoned over time. Let's look at another example. Phones. Landlines, the green line, are going down. Cell phones are going up. And a couple of years ago, they crossed. Now, more cell phones are in the US than there are landlines. Why do you care about that? Well, it may drive how you make a choice about your enabling technology. If you're building an app today, chances are you are already thinking a whole lot about mobile. Whereas 10 years ago, that would not have been a viable option depending on who your customer base was and how technologically savvy they are. So let's look at this from a conceptual perspective right now. In 1962, a sociologist who focused on rural technology adoption, Everett Rogers, put together the classic chart for innovation diffusion now. And he was actually looking at the adoption of seed corn by farmers in Iowa, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about, that has become the basis for our thinking about high-tech technologies as well. And what Everett Rogers observed was that there was a pattern to adoption. There were the very, very early people, the innovators, the early adopters, early and late majority, and then finally the laggards. And over time, adoption might reach 100%, like we saw with the colored TV example. Now, not every technology has exactly this pattern, but the general idea that the innovators have to break the ground first, and then you get to the early adopters, et cetera, has been an important factor in planning out how you actually introduce a product to market. So now let me show you what Geoffrey Moore did a number of years later, where he basically took Everett Rogers' insights and applied them to the Silicon Valley context. So we still have our innovators and our early adopters. And the idea that those early adopters are visionaries, people that are willing to see beyond the fact that you might have only a so-called minimum viable product. Not everything is exactly working yet. There's a learning curve associated with it. That those people will still see the benefit to what you have, and therefore are willing to take a plunge. But what Geoffrey Moore added to Everett Rogers' insight was this concept of the chasm, that going from the early adopters to the so-called early and late majority is a big jump because the needs of each category of adopter is different. Early adopters are visionaries. They are people that are interested in innovation for its sake and in doing new and better things. The early and late majority are going to be concerned about pragmatic issues. One of my colleagues talks about when you are introducing a new product, in the early market is when you build your reputation. But there are so few of those customers, you're not really going to be able to build a business from them. Therefore, you also need to think about what's necessary for the early and late majority when you're making your money, as my colleague says. Early market, reputation; later market, profit. You then move forward, and you'll be able to hopefully keep having people adopt your product. But keep in mind, other people are always innovating as well. So in fact, this curve ends up layering and layering on itself as you add new innovations with each iteration of your business. So let's think a little bit about why do some innovations spread more quickly than others? And Everett Rogers actually identified a number of characteristics. One is relative advantage. Are you better than their current alternative? Not as you would measure it, but as your customers would measure it. And that's why customer discovery and customer outreach is one of the reasons that it's so important. A second thing is, to what degree are you fitting or are you compatible with their existing practices and their existing values? And one of the challenges when you're selling into large organizations is they have legacy systems, they have infrastructure that it would be very expensive for them to replace. A third characteristic is simplicity and ease of use. The shorter the learning curve, the quicker the adoption. Fourth, you'd want to think about, how can I make it really easy for people to try my product or service? Trial ability. The lower their risk, the more likely they are to try your product or service, which is one reason that the freemium model has become so popular, where people can try software and use some of its basic features and then develop some sense of why they might benefit from more. And then finally, observable results. Remember that curve from the early adopters to the innovators to the late majority and the early and late majority. Those majority customers are looking for observable results. They want to know what someone else's experience was, which is the importance of a peer network used to reduce uncertainty for the part of the majority users. So in summary, keep in mind that approval is not the same as adoption, and it's not the same as diffusion. A lot of times you can get regulatory approval for a drug, say, or for a product that's used in agriculture or in food. But that doesn't mean that instantly it'll get adopted by companies or by end users of any type. And that also doesn't mean that a lot of them will start adopting it. In other words, it'll be diffused unless you've met the various criteria we've already talked about. So this gets summarized by Everett Rogers as the success of an innovation depends on how well it evolves to meet the needs of more and more demanding and risk-averse individuals in a population.